Thank you very much for that lovely welcome and for inviting me to be the first guest speaker of your presidency. David, I will try very much to do you proud. I am going to talk about human rights in childbirth and some other things this evening. I'm going to try to curb my natural tendency to be long-winded and leave a bit of time at the end for questions and discussion. So when I was putting tonight's presentation together, I started by thinking about how to introduce myself. And I have, until recently, been able to do that very easily by saying that I'm Chief Executive of Birthrights, the human rights in childbirth charity. But I stepped down last month to hand the baton on to someone else and concentrate on some of my other interests and jobs. I used to think I was interested in books and writing, so I did a literature degree. And then I got really interested in war poetry, so I did a master's in war studies because that seemed like the logical place to study war poetry. And through that I became interested in human rights. The idea of finding a system that navigates the tension between a tiny little individual who to themselves is of course the most important world, the universe, and the great big state. I worked for Human Rights NGO and then had a baby, and because apparently I can't stick with anything, I left the world of human rights and became a doula. I imagine everybody here knows what a doula is, but just in case you don't, a doula is a lay supporter of women through pregnancy and birth. We accompany them during their pregnancies, get to know them, stand side by side with them through their labour and birth, through shift changes, filling whatever gap there is in the room, depending on who else is there and what they bring. And then we go back afterwards when they're holding the baby and wondering what the hell to do with it. I, through that experience, started to write about pregnancy, birth, parenting, women's rights, met a human rights barrister, and we founded a charity that brought our interests in feminism, in childbirth, in women's rights together. And on the side, I've still continued to do the occasional bit of doula work, which is a wonderful way of reconnecting with some of the wonderful maternity care available, and also seeing the impact that such positive care and occasionally care that perhaps falls a little short can have on women. So when I was thinking about that introduction, I was worried that I perhaps have ADHD and that I'm not able to hold an interest in one career. It's very generously called a portfolio career, but perhaps it's just that I haven't decided what I want to be when I grow up yet. And I realised that actually the thing I'm interested in throughout all of this is people, is humans. That's what interests me in human rights, in childbirth. I'm not a medic, I'm not a lawyer, I am interested in the law, but I'm not that interested in the law. What I'm interested in is humans, in people. So I decided to retitle the presentation, if my clicker will work. There we go. It's just humans in childbirth. We'll definitely talk about rights too. But the thing that interests me about rights is how it applies to our humanity and how it maybe provides a system in which the very basic needs that we need to be met to survive and thrive as human beings is contained in there. David mentioned birthrights. We're nearly 6 years old, and it was set up as a hobby, a kitchen table organisation, but somehow it took off slightly more than we were expecting. We now have a board of midwives, an anaesthetist, a consultant obstetrician, a QC, lawyers, mothers, fathers, service users, all united in the belief that all women matter in this experience of giving birth, and that the human rights movement, the values that underpin it, and the legal scaffolding that gives it a very positive and sometimes enforceable kind of power could be used to promote better experiences in birth. The work we do now is a circular model from providing free advice to women, but also increasingly to midwives, to doctors, to family members on the law and maternity care. A number of resources from fact sheets to videos supplement that. And due to popular request, we have developed a suite of training offers. We go into NHS trusts, we teach on student midwifery courses. We'd really like to talk to more medical students. And we also do some work with frontline organisations, often volunteer organisations who support some of the most vulnerable pregnant women through their perinatal journeys. And through that we feel like we gather a lot of intelligence, ear to the ground intelligence about what's working and what isn't, what feels right to women and what doesn't, what questions the midwives and the doctors that we are supporting have and what they're experiencing in their trusts. And so we've developed a part of our work that is researching, finding out a little more about what the barriers to change might be, and trying to find a way to hear from women who perhaps don't necessarily shout the loudest, whose voices may be lost and whose stories, whose humanity we may not be hearing from. This is a study we did with Bournemouth University on the human rights and dignity experiences of disabled women, which did show some worrying problems with postnatal rooms, for example, in some areas not having access for women in wheelchairs, and women saying that they were offered less options, given less information because perhaps of how their disability was perceived. But we were also able to identify some examples of really positive practice. Here, the participant with a physical impairment told about the relationship she had with her midwife and how her midwife had taken time to try out some of the birthing equipment with her weeks before so that she was confident about what she could do and what the limits were given her physical impairment. The media, of course, goes completely berserk every time anybody mentions childbirth, and so we try to give sensible, balanced comment to the media. And as well as to highlight problems, such as in our recent campaign around maternal request caesareans, also find the opportunity to highlight good practice. In this case, looking at Birmingham Women's Hospital, who had co-produced with service users a guideline for women and a pathway for women who were requesting a caesarean without medical indication. And we've been able to share that with some of the trusts who've come to us since we identified that perhaps they weren't providing a respectful process to show how it can be done. And underpinning all of that is a need to identify groups of women who may be at greatest risk of receiving less maternity care, of having poorer outcomes, of not traditionally filtering into maternity voices, partnerships and other structures where their voices may be heard, and building partnerships with organisations like Birth Companions. I don't know if any of you know the work of Birth Companions, but they're a 20-year-old organisation that supports women giving birth in the prison system, and they also increasingly work with women with the most complex needs, facing severe and multiple disadvantages. So we're doing some research with them, with their service users, with specialist midwives, health visitors and social workers to try and get to the bottom of what the human rights challenges faced by this group of women are, and then to feed that into the work that we do, both campaigning and also working with policymakers to ensure that perhaps some of the most vulnerable women's voices and needs are being addressed at the higher levels. So, why did we bother with this? Why didn't I just stay being a doula or some more sensible, lucrative career? Well, the human rights values that are important in maternity care speak to, I think, some very real needs we have as human beings. So, underpinning the human rights movement is the idea that all human beings are born with an inalienable set of rights and should be treated with dignity. And flowing from that in a healthcare setting is the need to provide respectful care tailored to that individual and their needs. To offer real choices, not lip service choices, real choices wherever possible. Sometimes it's not possible, but when it is, to offer them. And to ensure that individuals have the chance to discharge something that I believe is absolutely fundamental to our well-being, to our physical safety and our emotional safety, that desire to be an autonomous individual, to give or not give our consent, to discharge our autonomy. So those human rights values speak to me, and they speak to me because I think they're about the essence of what it means to be human. And as I said, I'm really interested in what it means to be human. I'm interested in the situations in which knowledge about that humanity comes out. War, it's a pretty extreme situation which has accelerated psychiatry, technology. It's also produced some of the most wonderful art, the most incredible poetry, as well as deep suffering. And something about becoming a mother, something about maternity, seems to me to be quite an extreme experience too. Dignity, autonomy, respectful care and choice speak to me about being heard, about being seen, about being acknowledged as an individual in a great big system. And of course, human rights is, as I said, about that tension between the individual and the system. And so instead of going into looking at what Article 3 and Article 8 mean, and we'll skip past that in a bit later on, I wanted to start by just reading 3 things that I think begin to identify that sometimes there can be a problem in women's journeys to being mothers about not feeling heard, not feeling respected, and not feeling listened to. And then we'll talk about perhaps what the implications of that can be. This is a poem. My dad, who's here tonight, always taught me to start with a poem. It's how he won the gold medal in obstetrics, having, he says, never delivered a baby. He identified that the professor liked poetry, and so he started his essay by quoting some poetry. So I'm going to do the same today. I think it was probably a different poem, though. This was sent to me 2 days ago. I wrote an article about whether or not feminism in general has dealt with pregnancy and birth in the same way it's dealt with other reproductive rights. Has it paid as much attention to women giving birth as it has, for example, to women's rights around abortion? And someone sent me this poem by a poet who is completely invisible as far as I can see. I can't even find the year that this was written. I believe her name is pronounced Sia March. I'm just going to read it to you and then I'll tell you why afterwards. I would like to go to a meeting where my voice is heard and talk about my struggles to become a lesbian writer. I had 2 babies over 10 years ago. I would like to know you, to let you near enough to listen to my talking, my joys, or speaking bitterness. I had 2 babies over 10 years. Those of you who say I had a choice, you with no childcare, talking fast at me with your explanations. Mothers are well trained to listen. I had 2 babies over. You want me to hear you, don't you? You have stories to tell of your lives. I have time. I had 2 babies. You talk about your struggles, how to gather your thoughts together, your ideas, the colours of your minds. You move as quickly as you dare through the boring items on the agenda. Not terribly interested, you say, in I had 2. Organising childcare, much more fascinated if I move on to discuss the techniques of short story writing. I had. And the content and form of political fiction, poetry. I have to go now because my children are waiting. Before I talk about that, I want to set it against an extract from a complaint to the United Nations Special Rapporteur sent just very recently on the 31st of October by a parents group in Croatia. I've written about human rights in childbirth in Croatia before. There are some concerns, particularly when it comes to the provision of pain relief and anaesthesia. A lot of the complaints that were collected, thousands of complaints which were collected by this group, are about procedures done without anaesthesia. And this, which is distressing to hear, and I don't think has been particularly well translated, but this is a woman who clearly had a serious tear after giving birth. And she says, 50 minutes of sewing stitches without anaesthesia. 18 days later, I sat down for the first time. Giving birth is nothing compared to what followed. For nights, I would wake up my husband in panic, remembering the doctor's words, "Wow, she is so good, you cannot hear that she is alive." But I was left voiceless after 15 minutes of screaming. I do not think I will ever give birth again. These complaints were precipitated by a Croatian member of parliament standing up in the House earlier in October and speaking to the Minister of Health about a surgical management of a miscarriage she had had without anaesthesia. Her testimony was met with anger at her for oversharing in the House and disbelief that this would happen in Croatia. It has now been promised that these complaints will be investigated and that anybody who has been found to be lying will be punished. In both Seah March's poem and here, I see women trying to tell their stories. And in Seah March's poem, she tries to tell the story about having her 2 babies 10 years ago, and her voice disappears completely throughout the poem. In this complaint, this woman is praised for being quiet, for being a good girl, but actually she was left voiceless. The final piece I wanted to share is from Anne. I was Anne's doula when she had her second baby, and it was only when she'd had her second baby, and it had been a really positive experience. She had wonderful care, both from her obstetric team and from a case-loading team of midwives. But in her first birth, she says, no one was really treating me like a human being who might have feelings about what was going on. It didn't feel like anyone was trying to help me. It felt like I was in a process that was bigger than me, and I just had to go along with it without making too much fuss. It's not that they were malevolent towards me. It was just that they didn't care about me at all, except as a vessel for the baby. So that first human rights value of dignity, which to me feels like the important one, is about recognising that we need to listen to individuals. We put them right back up the hierarchy and say that they are important. We don't silence them. We don't praise silence. We don't let their voices disappear. And we actively seek out the voices of those who might not feel able, might not be able to come to us with their stories. In childbirth, the idea of dignity reinstates a woman as the central agent. If Birthrights had an office, and we don't, we keep costs down by being a virtual organisation, which has its pros and its cons. It's very difficult to organise a meeting. But if we did have an office, we would have carved above the door Kant's categorical imperative, which I have taken liberties with changing a little here. Humanity itself is a dignity, for a woman cannot be used merely as a means by any woman, but must always be used as an end. Or to put it a little bit more bluntly, as we do at Birthrights, a woman is not a suitcase. It's something that has come up time and time again with women that we've been supporting, but they feel like they're just a container, Anne said, a vessel, a piece of Tupperware. the lid can be wrenched off any moment for the precious contents to be retrieved. And I would suggest that my interest in humans, the humans I've spoken to, the needs we have as humans, it doesn't feel good to be reduced to being a suitcase. When Birthrights wrote to the National Maternity Review 3 years ago with a reasonably large group of eminent midwives and doctors, we were advocating for the use of a rights-based approach in what came out of that review. And we were saying that not only is the long-term physical and emotional health of women at stake and babies at stake in the care they're given, but that their fundamental rights to human dignity and autonomy can be profoundly affected by their experiences in maternity care. And that because pregnancy and birth are a vulnerable time for women, whether their human dignity and autonomy are respected can actually have direct implications on both that physical and emotional safety of them and their babies. So if we accept that pregnant women remain humans, which no one in here is an American politician, so you probably do, we say that they have the same set of rights as they did before they were pregnant. The English courts have gone a long way to insist that they do. They have said that women have perhaps more responsibility when pregnant, but exactly the same set of rights. We afford them that dignity, and thus we must treat them respectfully, give them choices, and ensure they can discharge their autonomy. And those are associated with a positive start to parenting. This Cook and Loomis study from 2012 found that women's positive and negative recollections of their birth experiences are far more related to feelings and exertion of choice and control than to specific details of the birth experience. You can have a good birth on paper and feel bad about it if you aren't enabled to make choices and feel in control. You can have a difficult birth that doesn't go to plan on paper and feel positive about it if you are involved in the decision making. Susan Ayres and colleagues' work on PTSD found that if women have a traumatic birth, they are more likely to experience PTSD if the most distressing events during their trauma involved fear and lack of control. I was lucky enough to hear her speak about it a couple of years ago, and she said that being kind, having somebody to be with a woman at all times, explain what's going on and ensure she is involved in the decision making can actually mitigate those experiences of trauma even in quite serious, distressing and frightening events. From the NCT and WI's Support Overdue report last year, which is a repeat of a report they had done, I think, 4 years previously, I found the language in this really interesting. Women wrote about feeling like cattle or a machine when they were describing negative experiences. They talked about the system in a mechanised, industrialised, robotic way. And they talked about themselves as kind of slipping away from their humanity, becoming as animals or as machines. And when they were doing that, they often talked about having a lack of options, having not had the opportunity to consent, having no control. The last quote, "I wasn't treated as a human," much like Anne said in her testimony. "I was just a product on a conveyor belt. I was not respected, and my birth has left me suffering PTSD." No one here is talking about human rights. No one here is talking about, whether their Article 3 rights not to be tortured or treated in an inhuman or degrading way were violated. But what they are talking about is something that doesn't feel human to them. They feel that their humanity has been taken away and that they're in a system rather than in a relationship. As humans, I'd suggest that doesn't feel okay. Exercising our rights and having them respected is important to human beings, even if we have no understanding of a rights framework, even the people who author headlines like "This human rights madness must end," which is one of my favourite ones, instinctively have a need to be treated as people, to spend time with people, to have themselves heard and listened to and validated. The positive and negative consequences of respecting rights or disrespecting them can be surprising and far-reaching. The Canadian Inuit people of Nunavik had a horrible problem in their local community with a spate of suicides of young people. Young people were taking their own lives, and so the elder women of the community felt that one solution would be to bring a birth centre back into this remote part of Canada. At that time, what happened, and what happens in quite a few remote communities, particularly with the Indigenous people of Australia, is that women are routinely evacuated a few weeks before their due date, put up in a hostel, which many describe as a very unpleasant experience. People always humbugging you for money and drugs is a quote from a woman who spent time in that hostel. And then they give birth without their family and supporters before returning home. Many Indigenous people place a great amount of importance on where you are born. The Canadian Inuit people of Nunavik did. Being born on your country, on your land, is an important part of your identity. When this birth centre opened, they did have excellent outcomes despite a lot of concern about safety. But the impact included something beyond that, a drop in domestic violence in areas where mothers were no longer evacuated for birth. When, in 2013, Birthrights partnered with Mumsnet to do a survey of 1,100 women about their experiences in maternity care, trying to understand a little bit more about what human rights issues there were. And we did a parallel piece of qualitative work interviewing midwives about the understanding of the idea of dignity. To me, some of the most interesting questions were asking women how their experience of birth had affected their feelings about themselves, about their babies, and about their partners. And you can see that 78% of women who had a spontaneous vaginal birth went into motherhood, a time when we know women are at the greatest risk of mental ill health, a time when suicide remains the leading indirect cause of maternal death in that first year, feeling more positive about themselves. But 77% of women who had an instrumental birth went into that period feeling that their birth experience had made them feel more negative about themselves. The findings weren't quite as marked, but they were still there when we asked them about the impact on the relationship with their baby. 59% of women who'd had an instrumental birth felt it had a detrimental impact on their relationship with their baby. 55% for the instrumental birth said it had had a negative impact on their relationship with their partner. Interestingly, instrumental births, the women who'd had those, were least likely to report respectful care. They were least likely to have caregivers who introduced themselves. They were least likely to say they had adequate pain relief. They were least likely to say they were treated with kindness and respect, or that they were in control during the birth. 24% of women who had an instrumental birth said they didn't feel they had agreed to each examination or procedure before it took place, which we felt was a pretty dramatic figure. I'd be very sure that all the caregivers in those situations felt they had been through a consent process, but consenting the woman in room 4 may not feel the same as discharging your autonomy. And some of the work Dave and I were doing in Oxford was around looking at lawful consent and looking at processes that might bring us closer to lawful consent post the Montgomery Lanarkshire case, that to me gets us closer to discharging autonomy rather than consenting someone. I spoke to a professor of psychiatry, who I think is Canadian, Harvey Chochinov, when I was doing some research. He is a specialist in dignity in healthcare, but focuses more traditionally on end-of-life care, where ideas of dignity have been more developed. And I asked him to think about why women who had less respectful care might feel worse about themselves. And he felt that giving birth weakens your natural autonomy anyway, because you're dealing with powerful contractions, or you have an epidural on board, or you're in an operating theatre. You are not the autonomous individual you were when you were walking around the day before. And that if at that time, when your autonomy is weakened, outside forces make you feel weaker, inadequate, or undermine your sense of dignity, you will feel the assault of these harsh judgments and may internalise them as being reflective of your self-worth. I tend to focus on the emotional impact of respectful care, having seen so many times the profound difference it can make even in very, very difficult births, and hearing women who 6 months after they have given birth remember with great detail the time somebody said something kind to them or made a great effort to explain what was happening. But others of my colleagues would spend this time talking more about the relationship between physical safety and rights respecting care. And I'll mention it here because I think it's vitally important. I talk about the emotional stuff because people tend to think it's airy-fairy, it's well, music and candles, and actually I think it's at the very root of improving women's journeys in maternity, particularly as today a new study has come out about postnatal depression. I don't know if anyone's picked that up. You're 174% more likely to experience postnatal depression if you've had complications in your birth experience. And it would be really interesting to unpick that and see whether it's actually the complexity of the birth, the problems, or whether it's, as that survey we did might begin to suggest, that in more complex births, in births that maybe are not going to plan, parts of respectful care that make you feel whole and human are lost. But getting back to safety. So this is last week's Embrace report. This is a couple of snippets from the one-pager layperson's summary. I found it really interesting that one of the things Embrace pulled out in that one-page summary was to advise women about balancing choices. The word choice is in there. Always consider individual benefits and risks when making decisions about pregnancy. So they are locating maternal safety in this balance of benefits and risk, personalised to an individual in the context of choice. And that's set against these statistics, which I'm sure you're all aware of, that whereas 8 in 100,000 white women will die in pregnancy, 40 in 100,000 black women will die in pregnancy. I was lucky enough to hear Dagny Rajasingham talk at the Race Equality Foundation. If you don't know her, she's a consultant obstetrician who does work with the RCOG. And she had gone into mortality and morbidity statistics and compared white women in the same socioeconomic and education group with black women and minority ethnic women in the same socioeconomic and education group, and found that the disparities existed even when these were exactly the same peer-to-peer groups. One of the reasons I like the human rights approach is that it is about equal care. It focuses on discrimination even when it is discomforting to think that there may be discrimination and bias and inequality tied to race in our system. Improving the maternal mortality rate for black women may need a human rights approach. And this is an earlier Embrace report here looking at perinatal confidential inquiry. The missed opportunities here, not investigating when a woman presents with concerns and then not responding appropriately to additional risk factors, including the woman returning with further concerns. In the poem I read, That woman wasn't listened to. These women were not listened to. There was an opportunity to value their expertise in their own pregnancies and their bodies, and perhaps not the culture, perhaps not the systems, perhaps not the staff to do that on that day. So the human rights idea isn't new in maternity care. Healthcare professionals already apply human rights principles to provide women-centred care. I think midwifery and obstetrics are perhaps instinctively interested in rights respecting care. NMC and GMC codes emphasise upholding patient dignity. CQC has a human rights approach to the regulation of services, and the latest NICE intrapartum guideline, CG 190, is stuffed full of human rights language. You can't move for the word dignity in there. But through the work that we do at Birthrights, going in, speaking to midwifery students, going into NHS trusts, we've been delivering some day-long workshops under the Department of Health's Safety in Maternity programme. It's been clear that perhaps the aspiration to have that human rights framework hasn't been met with an understanding, hasn't been met with enough education, enough understanding, enough shift in how you do that. And I turned to this study that was done in Australia by Sue Kriske, which asked midwives and doctors who should be the final decision maker in childbirth. Should it be the woman? Yes, said everybody, absolutely. Could you override her decision if you were concerned about the safety of the fetus? Lots of people who said yes to the first question also said yes to the second, which is of course confusing because the two things can't exist at the same time. A woman can't be the final decision maker if you can override her decision. When she investigated this, it was that people believed themselves, the caregivers believed themselves to be ultimately accountable for a poor outcome if it was causally connected to a woman's informed decision, which of course is not true. But you can see why that confusion might exist if you begin to apply a human rights framework and use human rights language, but you haven't invested in a culture change in education that supports it. If this was a birthrights training session, we would now spend some time looking in detail at human rights, but it's not, and it's already 4 minutes to 8. So what I'm going to do, it's not? No?
That's about 13 minutes.
That you're very clever to put a clock that's 10 minutes fast up here. You've heard me speak before. I was anyway going to whiz through these slides because I don't think we've got time, and it's not necessarily the right occasion. But I believe that it's really important to embed human rights education in medical and midwifery curriculums and in CPD, and those healthcare professionals on our board, the trainers who work with us agree, and we have had such wonderful reception from the NHS staff that we go and train who believe that having this knowledge has enabled them to deal with difficult situations, what to do if somebody wants to give birth outside of guidelines, what to do if you're coming under scrutiny from above for trying to support autonomy. We talk about the Human Rights Act, which articles are relevant to maternity care. Article 2, the right to life. Article 3, I've already referenced it, not to be tortured or treated in an inhuman or degrading way. Article 8, the right to respect for private and family life, which the European Court of Human Rights, in a number of cases in the last 8 years, has asserted that women's decisions, choices in childbirth are protected under Article 8. Right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion, right not to be discriminated against. It's also important to have an understanding of which are absolute rights. You can never torture or treat someone in an inhuman or degrading way. It's just not negotiable, but that means the threshold is very high. I probably couldn't sue under the Human Rights Act if you didn't bring me my post-birth toast quickly enough. Probably not meeting the threshold, but perhaps if I didn't have water for 12 hours that would meet that threshold, and claims have been brought underneath Article 3 in healthcare in the UK. Whereas Article 8 is a qualified right. I cannot say I would like to give birth on a roundabout at midnight with the entire obstetric and midwifery team in attendance, all dressed as unicorns while the New York Philharmonic plays in the background. I mean, I can ask, I can try, but it's okay to say no to that request. Article 8 can be balanced with needs to the wider community, with what it's acceptable to our staff to do. A lot of midwives and doctors don't want to dress up as unicorns. Workforce demands where you need to staff the labour ward on a Monday night. Just because Rebecca's giving birth on the roundabout doesn't mean we close the labour ward. But we start with the recognition that I have the right to ask and that my request is important. And then we have a conversation about why I wanted to give birth like that and what kind of care plan can be worked on that gives me what I need and protects the staff. So I think human rights and the law can improve maternity care because they're a values-based approach that improves care for both women and healthcare professionals. Research has shown that two of the most important factors in ensuring positive experiences of birth are those promoted by the principle of dignity, supportive relationships with health professionals, and a sense of control over decisions made during birth. But most rights are not trumps, and only 2 years to go till I don't have to be embarrassed to say the word Trump in public. It's a recognition of the right, the values underpinning it. It's the starting point for a conversation between a woman and a healthcare professional that recognises her as a human being with needs. It gives professionals a way to frame the process, from policy to evidence, proportionate decision making, and it provides a framework in which you can address those concerns, including the obligations to the wider community. It clarifies, when you're thinking about informed choice, clarifies the responsibility for the woman and the professional. If a woman makes the decisions, she takes responsibility for those decisions and the subsequent harm if it's causally connected to her choice. Professionals should not, I always mean to change cannot to should not because cannot is perhaps too hopeful, should not be criticised if they have supported an informed choice regardless of whether that choice is within guidelines. And as I said earlier, human rights puts on us obligations, of course, to look after all human beings, but recognises that there are certain groups who have vulnerabilities that mean they need more protection. It is contingent on us to work harder to ensure that they have the same standards of care as others. So human rights encourages us to look after those who might be at greatest risk, and perhaps going forward to involve them in the design of services. Always with the woman, the human, at the centre. I feel funny about the term woman-centred care because it's a bit of a sticking plaster sometimes. I like human rights because it's a little more enforceable perhaps than the idea of woman-centred care, but that's what it is. It's care in which the woman is at the centre. And the tensions between all those individual women and the system which needs to look after them can be navigated. Staff are humans too, certainly most of them. And I thought this study that came out last month was really interesting. Childbearing women's experiences of midwives' workplace distress. So the researchers asked women who had recent experiences in maternity care about the behaviour of their midwives. New mothers saw poor workplace practices, poor communication, service constraints and inconsistencies as barriers to them receiving high quality care. The women that they talked to, and they were particularly focusing on women who'd had experiences of midwives who seemed that they were in distress. To them, the midwives appeared stressed, rushed, crying, to have no control, and they tied that to them having a lack of compassion, poor workplace behaviours, substandard care and demoralisation. It's not what they felt. They were asked for some solutions. This is the women that were interviewed, and they talked about workplace support, psychological support. I thought this is a very human study. It's about relationships, and instead of just looking at what the emotional well-being of the woman is, they're looking at the emotional well-being of those caring and seeing if that has an impact. And there's plenty of research which of course shows that if you don't treat your staff very well and they are miserable and tired and they haven't had a break for ages, they may find it quite difficult to be compassionate. They may not feel very human themselves, so they may find it very difficult to spend time and effort and energy developing those human bonds and relationships, listening to the woman, treating her as an individual. So in order for the human rights version of improving birth to work, we must take care of staff. Staff well-being must be a priority. It can't all be about protecting women if we're not looking after those who need to be in a human relationship with them. Women talked about robotic care, and what they want is human care. And to be a human, we need to have our needs met, and that includes staff. I've got a few resources I've got the Midwifery and Human Rights Guide that Birthrights, the Royal College of Midwives and the British Institute of Human Rights produced together. The only reason it's midwifery and not more broadly aimed at obstetricians is that the Equality and Human Rights Commission insisted we call it this and wouldn't fund it otherwise. But it is very, very relevant to anybody working in maternity care. I've got a few copies that you available there for you to take, and there's lots on the Birthrights website. I have embarrassingly bought a few copies of my books, which if you would like to purchase them, they will be available afterwards. And do visit the Birthrights website, where there are some very practical training videos on issues such as consent, and particularly looking at the Montgomery Lanarkshire case. I did want to end with another poem, which has nothing to do with maternity care, and I'm just ending with it because I like it, but also because I think it says something about our needs as human beings, the relationships we need to feel human, the imperfection of those. Giving birth is never going to be 100% safe. Services are never going to be 100% perfect. Human relationships are very complicated and difficult, but somehow we all need each other. And this poem, to me, is a way that illustrates that. We who are your closest friends feel the time has come to tell you that every Thursday we have been meeting as a group to devise ways to keep you in perpetual uncertainty, frustration, discontent and torture by neither loving you as much as you want nor cutting you adrift. Your analyst is in on it, plus your boyfriend and your ex-husband, and we have pledged to disappoint you as long as you need us. In announcing our association, we realise that we have placed in your hands a possible antidote against uncertainty, indeed against ourselves. But since our Thursday nights have brought us to a community of purpose, rare in itself, with you as the natural centre, we feel hopeful you will continue to make unreasonable demands for affection, if not as a consequence of your disastrous personality, then for the good of the collective. Thank you very much.